So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our winter series of the New Energy series. My name is April Salas, Executive Director of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society. I'm pleased to introduce today's topic and speaker. The topic of today's conversation is carbon capital, the moral metric of energy finance, and we have the distinct pleasure of welcoming Dr. Sean Field, who's a research fellow at University of St. Andrews. A little bit about Sean. He's a research fellow at the Center for Energy Ethics and in the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of St. Andrews. And since late 2018, his research has focused on how financial professionals ethically and financially value energy. His work explores the calculation of risk, the performance of financial expertise, the valuation of energy resources, and the integration of concepts like ESG, environmental, social, and governance into investment practices. A key implication of his research is that the world of finance is central to the materialization of our collective energy landscape. And Dr. Field's project is part of the larger energy ethics research project led by Dr. High and funded by the European Research Council. I also did a little digging and I noticed that Dr. Field started his career in finance at RBC in Toronto, Canada, followed by time at the World Bank in New York and Ghana. So I hope he can shed a little light on those experiences. He has a distinguished academic resume, including a Bachelor's of Commerce with a focus on marketing management, Master's of Science focused on food, agricultural, and resource economics, as well as a PhD in economic geography. So today's talk is going to draw on the ethnographic fieldwork with energy financiers in Houston, Texas. And Dr. Field explores how experts use a lexicon of models and metrics to conceptualize and construct allegories about future hydrocarbon projects and companies. He will show that allegorical narratives built with this lexicon advance the kind of energy ethics, distinguishing what is good and advancing for particular energy futures. As the energy industry pivots towards renewables, Dr. Field argues that these metrics, models, and allegories are coming to bear on new forms of extraction. And we've shared in advance of this his recent paper, Carbon Capital, the Lexicon and Allegories of U.S. Hydrocarbon Finance. So thank you, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Sean Field.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you. And thank you for such a kind introduction. I think that was perhaps too kind. Let me start by sharing my screen and I'll get right into it. Can you see it okay?
Yes, it's great.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you, Sean.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you so much, Research Fellow and Incoming Director of Policy for the Center of Energy for Energy Ethics. And I'm joining you today from the east coast of Scotland at the University of St. Andrews. For those who aren't familiar with it, which is a relatively small university, it's nestled on the cliffs of East Scotland overlooking the North Sea. It's the third oldest school in the UK following Oxford and Cambridge, and it is in league with them. So for example, it's one of the top universities, not only in Scotland, but across the UK in general. It's commonly known as the birthplace of golf and where the Royals go to university. So just a bit of background. So what I'm presenting today, as April suggested, it draws on an article published open access in the Journal of Economy and Society that was published a couple months ago. And it is coinciding with a larger corpus of work. Oh, there we go. Just advancing. My project is part of a larger multi-country project funded by the European Research Council. And what it looks at is the ethical sensibilities of people who finance energy in the United States. So overall, this work, and so I'm presenting the top work from the top article today, but it draws a little bit on these other pieces that I've been working on. It looks at how feelings of responsibility and perceptions of risk in terms of finance, climate change, and personal risk, shifting formal and informal social hierarchies, the economics and financial calculations, which I'll be focusing on today, inequalities of gender and race, and notions of faith in God, how all of these things come to bear on how the people I got to know, and so we use a fancy word in social anthropology, we call it interlocutors, but other people say informants, how they come to know the world around them and how they act on it, how they understand what is right and good, and how they make choices in the context of energy and a world defined by climate change. So in some ways, this draws on my not only my current training, but my background training in economic statistics and quantitative analysis, but also my training as a social anthropologist. And so just for context, for those of you who are not quite sure what social anthropologists do, social anthropologists have sometimes been described as the psychologists of communities. I'm not sure if that's quite accurate, but generally social anthropologists study how people study people using a whole range of research methods. They embed themselves within communities for many months and sometimes years, and they collect interview data, survey data, observational data, quantitative, photographic, and secondary data to create this really rich picture of how it is that a particular community functions and how people in that community understand their world. Key to this research is a sense of empathy for the people that we work with, and to suspend our moral judgment and to understand people from where they are. So the work I present today is based on ethnographic field research that began in late 2018. And as April said, it looks at how these experts use a lexicon of models and metrics to conceptualize and construct allegories about future hydrocarbon projects and companies. So what do I mean by allegories? Before I start and jump into it, allegories convey not just a descriptive narrative, but also a set of ethical sensibilities and moral conclusions that instruct and orient both orators and audiences. And by ethics, I use the notion of ethics to capture the ways in which people understand and ethically evaluate the world and the futures that they deem to be good and valuable. This draws on the anthropology of ethics and the theory within, which does not endeavor to judge people as good or bad, but rather acknowledges that people are evaluative, where the process of evaluation is inherently ethical. So here I'm using the idea of ethics as a non-static evaluative framework by which people come to make moral conclusions about the world and how they make decisions. And so this is different than other notions of ethics you might be familiar with, which are typically normative theories and concepts about what is morally required, forbidden, or permitted. So this would be the realm of virtue ethics, which is about moral character, deontology, which emphasizes duties and rules, and consequentialism, which emphasizes the consequences of actions. So this is sort of a, don't get caught up in this, but this is sort of the perspective I'm coming at in terms of ethics. So before I jump into the, I'm going to read some vignettes from the paper and sort of take you through it, just little pieces of it. But for context, so why look at this problem? Why is it that we even care about why energy financiers view the world? So this study is set in Texas, which is the largest oil producing state in the United States and produces about half of all oil produced in the United States today. In the past, sometimes more, depending on what we're talking about. And while the US oil industry started in Appalachia, it was really founded in Texas, where the largest oil fields in the country were found in the first half of the 1900s. The second piece of context is the shale revolution. So many of you know the shale revolution began in the early 2000s. But before that, the US was a declining oil and gas producer. And the narrative, both the public and policy narrative before this happened, was that we were in a peak oil era. So oil was running out, oil and gas were running out. And this is because only a small fraction of the underground hydrocarbons could be accessed. These are called conventional reserves, which I'll talk about in just a moment. What changed and what's significant is that the shale revolution changed all that. It turned all of that on its head, because what basically happened was that all of a sudden you could access this world of oil and gas that we didn't think we would be able to access before. And importantly, this came at a time when oil and gas prices were rising and during an unprecedented period of low interest rates. As you can see here in this graph, the dotted line is interest rates, and this line here is oil prices. And I've mapped out sort of the different phases of the shale revolution, which I'll explain a little bit more, and I can answer some questions in the Q&A. So in terms of what am I talking about, fracking and unconventional gas? So when I say unconventional, it's a synonym that's also used, you could say fracking. And so when we talk about conventional and unconventional, conventional are these pools of gas and oil that migrate over time and are trapped under impermeable rock layers, usually salt. And so typically in the past, we would drill into these, and the pressure, we would either extract them by pumping them out, or the pressure would push them out. Unconventional or fracking goes to the source rock, so that where the actual oil and gas is contained, and drill sideways and then use hydraulic fracturing to help access that oil and gas. Now, these two technologies have been around for a very long time, for over half a century, but it was the combination of these two things, plus some innovation in terms of how they were completed, that all of a sudden the world revolutionized in the United States and started in Texas, could access a world of oil and gas that we previously was unthinkable. Now, why finance? There are many types of oil and gas finance, and here I'm focusing on exploration and production. That is the finding and extracting part. And so you can see here there's different types of finance with different sort of risk return profiles. Reserve-based lending has been around since the 1930s, after which other forms of finance have been evolved, have sort of come along. Private equity is significant here. And it was, it existed since the 1950s, but really became a formative force in the early 2000s, coinciding with the shale revolution. So whereas reserve-based lending, the bank will lend you a loan based on how much oil is in the ground, private equity it invests in small companies to go and extract and find oil. So it's a bit more risky, but the returns are much higher. And their clients are typically trusts, foundations, universities, pension funds, and high net worth individuals. Now, the oil and gas sector in the United States has always depended on private investors. They've always played a central role in the US oil industry. But it was in the 2000s that they really came into being. First, there was a couple of private equity firms that were operating out of Texas, and it just so happened that they were in the right place at the right time and provided a capital for these companies to go find this oil and gas. And this was hugely successful because they were able to produce returns for their investors that were 10 times the original investment. Think of this by contrast with your average rate of return of like 5 or 7%, or what you get from a bank account. Once this happened in the early 2000s, hundreds of new private equity firms were established. And all of a sudden, this huge amount of money went into the US oil sector. What this created was more oil and gas activity in the United States than anyone had seen in decades. And this is what made the United States the largest oil and gas producer in the world, something that was completely unimaginable. The excitement about the shale revolution faded in 2019, which is where I'm going to pick up with the vignette in just a moment. And at this point, the most productive reserves had already been identified because we'd been into the shale revolution for almost 20 years. Oil prices started to stagnate, investor returns started to fall, and investors and lenders started to withdraw from the sector. The vignette, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment, is meant to pull you into the world in which I was immersed. So if you don't have a finance and economics background, the acronyms might be jarring, but don't get hung up on them. Instead, as I'll explain, what I want you to pay attention to is how the financial metrics are used as the ethical scaffolding on which moral arguments are made. It is 7:30 in the morning and the dining room is packed. Capital discipline has been demanded, the speaker says, looking out into the crowd of faces staring back at him. He continues, the Fidelities of the world introduced this concept called capital discipline. The general definition is growth within cash flow, pay dividends, 4% dividend yield, 4% production growth within EBITDA. The definition of an E&P company, exploration and production, is the antithesis of capital discipline. Now we have valuations at 20-year troughs. Whether you look at TEV, EBITDA, TEV to PV10, investors are rightly skeptical. Are companies just borrowing time? Can they really achieve this? We are at a monthly breakfast meeting of the Houston Oil Finance Association in late 2019, a monthly ritual in the Houston hydrocarbon finance community. The speaker is a managing director at a well-known private equity firm founded by two prominent US arbiters. He has done the math, he says, and the prognosis for the US hydrocarbon exploration companies is bleak. Companies that have led a renaissance in the US hydrocarbon industry with the advent of unconventional extraction, colloquially known as fracking, have been financially imprudent, he says, and many will not be able to make the transition to growth, from growth to discipline in the months ahead. He explains, 80 to 85% of the companies cannot achieve this capital discipline. Something between 15 and 20% can. We were being very generous in our math when we got this, There's another way of running the math that says no one can. There's somewhere between 0 and 15% that can achieve capital discipline. The story that he is weaving is an allegorical narrative of a U.S. industry in transition following a 15-year boom associated with the shale revolution. For over a decade, investors and lenders poured capital into U.S. onshore unconventional hydrocarbon extraction during a growth phase in the U.S. oil and gas industry not seen since the early 1980s. This created a flurry of exploration and production activity predicated on proving the future profitability of prospective hydrocarbon reserves that could be sold for proportion of their expected net present value. Investor fervor for U.S. unconventional exploration and production was hastened by the early success of private equity financiers specializing in E&P. I'll use E&P for exploration and production in the mid-2000s, and by the global financial crisis that challenged institutional investors to meet their actuarial targets. By late 2019, however, the industry entered a bust cycle with stagnating and later falling oil prices, challenging E&P companies to make profits. This is what he refers to when he talks about the shift from growth to discipline. The right strategy going forward for investors, the managing director argues, is to buy a PDP for cheap and make all kinds of money. The right strategy for lenders is PDP-covered loans that are priced up relative to the history of the borrower. While this language may have little meaning for people outside of oil and gas finance, for people in this community, it constitutes prescriptions about the appropriate way that capital should exploit U.S. onshore hydrocarbon resources. Investors and lenders should focus on extracting profit from proven, developed, producing hydrocarbon assets, and companies who own them by imposing cost-minimizing strategies, discipline. Investors and lenders, by contrast, should avoid proven undeveloped hydrocarbon assets in companies that want to drill these prospects with the hope of making profit from future expected growth, at least for now. He's weaving this allegory with a lexicon of hydrocarbon, of the lexicon of hydrocarbon finance, a mixture of Wall Street infused terms, economic concepts, and metrics specific to the hydrocarbon industry. There is some disagreement within this community of financial professionals on what metrics are most important, and the metrics of preference in this lexicon change from time to time. Collectively, however, this lexicon forms a regime through which to define the economic value of hydrocarbons and companies, to imagine their value in the future, and to justify flows of capital. The sea of blue and gray suits crested with peaks of white, gray, and salt and pepper hair are watching and listening intently. They know or seem to know what he is talking about because they too speak the language. They are private equity partners, investment bankers, commercial lenders, asset managers, insurance brokers, financial consultants, and lawyers, all specializing in oil and gas finance. They connect investment and loan capital from all over the world, with small to medium-sized E&P companies operating in the lower 48 states of the continental United States. Their clients are some of the largest institutional investors in the world, and they are the people who financially fueled the shale revolution. The financial metrics and models that they use are utilized to craft an allegorical narratives of imagined hydrocarbon futures. Metrics and models play an essential role in the construction of ethical narratives on which energy decisions are made by narrowly defining value in time. The concept of allegories, meanwhile, highlights that financial narratives of imagined energy futures are not merely descriptive, but advance a kind of energy ethics. In an era defined by public concern about anthropogenic climate change and calls to decarbonize capital, that is, to divest, future energy projects are pitched, mineral rights are transacted, wells are drilled, pipelines are built, infrastructure is constructed, and money is invested based on the allegorical imaginaries woven with this lexicon. Scholar Cara Wood shows that shareholder value is not just produced through a company's current E&P activities. Instead, the financial value of hydrocarbon companies is based on the estimated value they will produce in the future in the form of oil and gas reserves to be extracted. Financial calculations and economic models that are entangled with the geology of a company's reserves are essential to the apprehension of hydrocarbon potentiality and future cash potential. Geological estimates combine forward-looking productivity decline curves and the financial metrics of net present value and discounted cash flow that collectively liquidate the future into the present by framing the future hydrocarbon extraction in terms of a temporal rate of return. These metrics and models also take another temporally entangled dimension. They fostered a shared imagination of future value creation and offer a shared moral horizon between investors, lenders, and entrepreneurs. Metrics orient financial counterparties and collaborators toward common profit-seeking goals and prompt them to collectively imagine the materialization of anticipated outcomes. Now, this is important for attracting and retaining investors and lenders because hydrocarbon finance fundamentally turns on performances of credit. Derived from the Latin word credere, meaning to trust or believe, a defining feature of credit is its function to link the past, present, and future. Investors and lenders are exchanging money in anticipation that they will get their money back, plus a profit at a future date, of course. As an interlocutor explained to me, the investor has to believe in what he's investing in because investors, as well as lenders, must anticipate they will recoup their capital. Financial metrics and economic models, then, lend a sense of imaginary assuredness, thickening expectations into anticipation. Charts, tables, and illustrations, such as these ones here, which are some of the ones I've got from the industry, make these imaginaries more credible. Financiers play a critical role in crafting these imaginaries of the future using metrics and models, leading to the subsequent allocation of investment capital in pursuit of these imaginaries. Narratives built on models and metrics are the basis of the flows of capital in the US hydrocarbon industry. This is because it's not possible to bring investors and lenders down the well hole to show them how much oil and gas there is, nor is it possible to transport them into the future to show them what oil prices will be and how much money is to be made. It is possible to imagine this, however. Financial metrics and economic models provides ways of imagining how much oil and gas is underground and how much it is all worth through virtual as-ifs woven around tables of numbers and graphs. In this regard, they constitute what some scholars describe as technologies of the imagination, that is, concrete processes by which imaginative effects are engendered by producing imagined hydrocarbon futures and the place of lenders and investors in these futures. Metrics and models are more than just the building blocks of narratives, however. They double as moral calculative devices about the right energy futures. For example, in his analysis of the Black-Scholes formula as a model for estimating financial options prices, Bill Maher makes a similar suggestion. The Black-Scholes formula is a moral argument, he argues. It is a deontology of the way things ought to be, and the metrics it produces for options prices are a moral appraisal of the value of things. To take this argument a step further, the persuasive power of these models and metrics is not confined to the numbers that they produce, but how they are woven into allegorical narratives. In this vein, distinguished economist and literary scholar Deirdre McCloskey and her colleagues have drawn attention to how economic narratives are allegorical, where economic concepts and calculus lends a rhetorical authority of being right. Allegories convey not just a descriptive narrative, but also a set of ethical sensibilities and moral conclusions that instruct and orient orators and audiences. Even general terms like economic and uneconomic not only communicate profitability or the lack thereof, but also communicate a rightness or wrongness about a particular presence and futures. In the hydrocarbon industry, the concept of allegory draws attention firstly to the ethical frameworks that models and metrics furnish economic narratives. Secondly, it draws attention to the fact that they are also moral arguments about what the right courses of action and the right futures are to strive for. In this regard, models, metrics, and the allegories constructed with them are endowed with a sort of energy ethics. Common arguments supported by metrics amongst my interlocutors, such as the economics of a project, it has to work out on an economic basis. The economics are challenged. None of that drilling is economics. Are these resource plays truly economic? And the economics suck, are not just hollow rhetoric, but ways of conceptualizing what is right and wrong and advocating for certain energy and hydrocarbon futures. Financial metrics and models are the scaffolding that allegories about energy presence and futures are built, or that are good and valuable are built. It is common, for example, to hear my interlocutors describe companies and oil and gas assets in the lexicon of these metrics. In casual conversation, they'll say things such as target returns 20% IRR or 2 times ROI. EBITDA, mean EBITDA was 1.7 billion. You could probably get a double-digit IRR out of that deal and generate free cash flow. These are central to the everyday discourse of oil and gas financiers and the practice of economic evaluation, and help determine what energy futures are materialized. So in the paper, I explain what each of these acronyms mean and break down and how they frame the concepts of value and time. Importantly, all these metrics that I've mentioned, and if you're interested, I'll go through them in the paper and be happy to answer your questions. All of them are future oriented. Some are short-term, measured in months and quarters. Some are longer-term and measured in years. For private equity financiers that really led the shale revolution, their time horizons in terms of the allegories, metrics, and moral horizons that they work with is 3 to 5 years. For lenders, it's 8. And beyond this, these metrics and the allegories woven from them kind of fade into the fog of time. Now, you can contrast this with deep time, by which, this is an academic concept by which people emphasize understanding our world in terms of geological timescales that extend well beyond our lifetimes. And by contrast, these financial timeframes are really short. The choice of metrics that financiers and investors tend to choose depends on a number of factors, including whether the industry is in a boom or bust, the life cycle of a firm, and their confidence in the executive team of particular companies. But often they use several metrics in combination. As moral calculative devices that illuminate allegories about hydrocarbons, what these metrics do is distill all the factors associated with making oil and gas finance decisions into unitary metrics of current and in future anticipated financial values. They distill all the information about hydrocarbon assets and companies into net cash flow, net revenue, initial investment, and the discount rate. And in doing so, they exclude a wide range of qualitative information about people, places, and things outside their modular calculus. Now, there is a logic to this, many tell me. By synthesizing the materiality of hydrocarbons, companies, and assets into financial metrics, it allows a wide range of objects inside and outside the industry to be readily compared and evaluated based on their future anticipated profitability. Their narrow and objective focus also lends a sense of transparency and authority to the resulting figures and allegories that they support. They cut out all the messiness of hydrocarbons, the places of extraction, the people it affects for better or worse. And in doing so, what I suggest is that they make a double move. They distill the calculative variables under consideration, while at the same time presenting totalitizing imaginaries of assets and companies. As technologies of the imagination, they provide calculative reasons to why oil and gas investments, loans, and projects should or should not happen, and illuminate the process of what academics call assetization. This is a hypothetical analysis that I put together. Hypothetical because not because it's pulled out of thin air, but because I made it up. It's not based on real wells, but this is the sort of calculus that that my interlocutors would do and present to investors. And I've double checked these numbers by them, and this is a realistic hypothetical for a small drilling program that you would sell to investors. And you can see here that not only is this a relatively short time frame, because it's looking at a unconventional wells. So unconventional wells tend to be depleted very quickly, but also in terms of how it frames profitability. And so this is how you would approach an investor for oil and gas with this sort of calculation. So now let me further illustrate the power of these metrics and models with an ethnographic encounter with an interlocutor whom I call Alex. Alex trained as a reservoir engineer and worked for several well-known oil and gas companies with E&P activities in the United States and around the world. Now, he is the vice president of a medium-sized oil and gas firm, and his role straddles the divide between financial expert and in-house reservoir engineer. There is a large poster with interlocking squares and rectangles imposed on a map of the Gulf of Mexico on the wall of Alex's office, showing how the area is divided up for oil and gas production leases. On the whiteboard beside me, there's a hand-drawn picture of an oil well with numbers scribbled beside it in dry erase marker. And there's 11 by 8 piece of paper with colorful seismic graph plotted with geological layers of drilling prospect taped to the wall. These artifacts reveal the engineering side of his work, estimating the location, size, and quality of hydrocarbon reserves. Alex tells me he does the economics for the firm. I ask, when you say you're doing the economics, what do you mean specifically? It's the reason I'm here, he says. I do the economics for the exploration, and I also do the economics for the acquisition. Whether a company is looking to drill a new well or buy a new land prospect, the most important thing he has learned, he tells me, is people really want to make sure they're going to get their money back. And if you can't show them, you're not going to get anybody to do anything. He has learned how to do economic analysis. He learned how to do economic analysis when he worked at Anna Oil, he explained. Now, all of these are synonyms for both the company names and the people, of course. What I learned with them is that economics are everything. You've got to have reserves to boot the economics. And that's what guys like me do. We do the reserves too, but then we usually run the economics. It's critical. We got investors coming in to look at these blocks of land to drill. They want to see how much money they can make. By economics, he means financial metrics and models that anticipate, that see the future and inform decisions about what hydrocarbon projects should be materialized based on what is profitable. Investors are not interested in the material aspects of extraction. That's Alex's job. They want to know what it financially means for them. If a company cannot make 20% rate of return for its investors, he says, you don't do it. That way you call off a bunch of stuff, separate all the junk off. He shows me how he puts all the information about various oil and gas wells into a program on his computer and runs a probabilistic distribution of the development of each. I run all the probabilities, all the outcomes, all the way through to the dollars per share impact for investors, he says. We're big into discounted cash flow. We'll look at what investors are going to get back in time at a discounted rate. We do a full suite of economics. They're very rigorous. Nothing gets done without the numbers. Figuring out the value of an oil well is the biggest part of an acquisition, he says, because unless you can figure out a value on it, it's worthless, he tells me. There can't be reserves unless there's economics. You have to show that it has value, that it has to have more cash flowing than it costs. Otherwise, you can't call it reserves. His observation that hydrocarbon reserves exist insofar that they can be imagined to have future financial value reveals insight into the power of metrics and models in shaping allegories about what energy future should be materialized or even imagined. Hydrocarbons locked underground cannot be classified as energy reserves if they do not have financial value. Using economic models and financial metrics, he separates what imagined futures have value and what futures are worthless. The allegories he weaves are not inconsequential. They are the basis for whether wells are drilled, hydrocarbons are extracted, and companies and acreage are bought and sold. It is Alex's job to make sense of oil and gas futures, as he puts it. Alex is not unique in this regard. As he said, this sort of economic financial analysis is what all the big companies do. My other interlocutors also perform similar economic analyses, weaving stories of future value with economic concepts and financial metrics. What Alex and the managing director have in common is that they frame what makes sense, imagine the future, and craft allegories about what energy, about energy in the financial lexicon of the industry. And these people who I'm talking about are at the heart of the US hydrocarbon sector. The ethnographic encounters and the models and metrics I've explored here contribute to broader debates of what we call financialization. These metrics and models are the ethical scaffolding on which allegorical narratives are crafted. Unpacking these metrics, where they come from and how they are used, and their components helps us better understand how they define time and value, as well as the allegories that are constructed with them. The temporal horizons defined in these metrics, as I've shown, are not 100 years or 50 years or 25 years. The futures they imagine and the decisions they inform about energy projects are much shorter than that. Moreover, what constitutes value becomes starkly clear. in terms of its financial focus. Beyond understanding how these metrics, models, and allegories have come to shape the present energy landscape of the United States, they have much broader implications. The decarbonization of capital, many tell me, has more to do with dismal investment returns in oil and gas between 2015 and 2020 than a green shift in investor sentiments. Moreover, they are being applied to renewable forms of energy production, shaping whether or not renewable energy infrastructure is materialized or not. And many told me that one of the downfalls of renewable energy is that it can't produce the same sort of financial returns that oil and gas can when it's successful. So understanding how this lexicon makes sense to the world, the imaginaries it creates, and the realities that it materializes, opens up opportunities to better shape or oppose the larger energy worlds we find ourselves in. And moreover, it provides an occasion for us to reflect on whether the ethical frameworks embedded in this lexicon and the moral conclusions of its allegories coincide with our own ethical frameworks and the moral ambitions that we have for the future we want to create. Thank you very much.
Sean, thank you so much for your remarks. I think that one of the beauties of the New Energy series is the opportunity for us to see multiple methodologies and to have an anthropological study like this one of this particular set of financiers is really fascinating. I want to take just a moment to give a little bit of introduction to April Salas, our moderator for today. April is our executive director at the Irving Institute for Energy and Society, which she mentioned. But what she didn't note is that her experience in the energy industry, in the energy sector, is long and deep. And I think that really, I'm looking forward to the conversation between you and April and the questions that she's going to help you to field, because she brings experience from the leadership of the business school at Dartmouth for a number of years as the executive director for the Rever Center for Energy Sustainability and Innovation. She served as director of the White House Quadrennial Energy Review Task Force Secretariat during the Obama administration. She's led several other roles at the Department of Energy and has also played both international and local roles in looking at how we can advance community power and community voice in the energy conversations that we have locally. And so I think that her business expertise, energy sector expertise, make her a great conversation partner for you as we are fielding the questions for today. So I just wanted to insert that little intro before letting y'all dig into the questions. I know that we received a few ahead of time, and a reminder for attendees to plunk those into the Q&A. If you don't plunk them into the Q&A, then I will, because I've got lots of questions for Sean. But I'll hand the mic over to April, and thank you again for giving us such good provocation, Sean, for conversation.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And Sean, thank you so much for your presentation and your research. What Amanda also didn't note is I started my career in energy finance, primarily working in the oil and gas industry. And so it's a really interesting arc, but it sort of drives home many of the points that you make, made in your presentation. I also note that you said your internet connection is unstable, so we'll do our best. And I think one of the interesting things that I sort of pulled from your talk, is just this concept of thinking about finance and this extractive industry with words like trust and ethics and morality. And I think it's always this interesting dynamic. And so some of the words that I pulled beyond allegories and ethics were really linking it to advocate, playing an advocacy role for the energy future, and how financiers, maybe almost conceptually, I mean, you almost alluded to the fact that they may be shaping, our energy and climate future. And I was just kind of hoping you can react to that connection, in live, and talk a little bit more about how you see that direct linkage. I mean, would you go as so far to say that they have a role in guiding where we go?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. And so I'm plugged in here at the university. I'm not sure that it's setting the university down to sleep with the internet along with it, but hopefully it holds. I think it's like financiers, I think, are amongst the strongest advocates for any particular future, in particular energy futures, just because of the pivotal role that they play between sources of capital and the larger worlds that are materialized around us. And I think other scholars of finance have made this connection. And one of the reasons I came to this research, because I used to work for RBC and I used to work in the financial sector, and I got to see how it was that financiers shaped not only just the lives of people, but broader society. And what was really interesting in conducting this research, and I got to know many of my interlocutors while I went to church with them. They came over for barbecues. We went to the pool, and so I really got to know their lives, and like that was the point of the study. And while this paper focuses on metrics and models, this was one of the things that entered into their ethical framework when they were deciding about what sort of worlds were going to be created by connecting investors with projects. Other sources came to be their sense of faith. And so, for example, many of them are deeply faithful, but many of them also trust in the financial models and metrics that they came to learn through, doing an MBA or doing an undergraduate in finance or both. Yeah, so I think it's interesting, and I think understanding, the larger study of finance and financiers has really taken off in the last 20 years, starting with Michael Callan, of course, with this whole idea of the performative role of financiers. But energy financiers, I think, are one of the groups of people that have been largely left out of this literature, which I think is so, for me, really interesting to study because they play such an important role. And understanding their world, I think, is really important, and it was really a fascinating project. So I hope in this paper, while I focus on just this one little bit of the larger ethical frameworks that they're working on, and the other papers and in the book that I'm working on, it goes through some of these other aspects. So for example, in the second chapter of my book, I look at how in Texas in particular has a particular historical imaginary of cowboy and frontier that filters into the ethical frameworks of many of the people I came to know, describing themselves as cowboys or wanting to work with cowboys. And it came with this cavalierness in a way that this like level of optimism that I've studied other sectors, and there's a level of optimism in the oil sector that I've never seen before. And it was interlaced with this like sort of cowboy imaginary. So yeah, I think that they are advocates in our world, but they're often advocates that are largely unseen because of the way that the financial sector often works in the background.
Well, I'll come back to a quote that you used because it struck me as having some duality, but this concept around the economics and things needing to have the ability to show a return or a profitability. And it kind of likens my own mind back to sort of the arc of available resources, otherwise known today as kind of energy security, and its linkage to what we now think of as national security. It's hard, not to think of it as you were describing the shale revolution today, exiting this peak oil era, and then coal, and even extraction of oil from whale carcasses before that. And so when you think about resource availability and even looking to the future post shale revolution to even renewables or what its role can play, it's hard not to have this ever-present example with the European energy crisis, right? Where just the fragility of the extractive and the transmission component to that. And so when you think about the economics, I would love to just hear your thoughts again on this concept of where the boundaries of ethics and moral metrics apply.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually one of the things, it's going to be the epilogue in the book, though, right? I think it's a great question because all of a sudden the world changed. I finished, I was coming off this research just as the COVID pandemic was happening and the world locked down. And, it's interesting to see how the narratives change, especially here in Europe, because many people know we're in the midst of an energy crisis in the UK, which I've been writing on popular blogs and stuff. And the way that people understood oil and gas was very much previous to this energy crisis that we're now experiencing, that the impetus was the war in Ukraine, was that oil and gas, the popular narrative is that oil and gas is bad, and that we need to transition. That's a very common narrative. Now, my interlocutors, of course, disagreed with that, but it's funny because a lot of what they said has ended up becoming, more floating and sort of a popular narrative. So all of a sudden people started to realize how much of their lives evolved around oil and gas here, and started to value it in sort of not just financial ways, but in a ways that was more connected in the way that you say, like energy security. For example, 80% of households in the UK are heated by natural gas. Natural gas prices have more than doubled. So all of a sudden it's changed people's lives in profound ways. And so I think that the world of oil and gas and our perceptions of energy transition have changed since the war in Ukraine. So it's become really apparent that there was a lot of talk about energy transition, renewable energy, and there was a realization that when the war in Ukraine started, that we are not anywhere close to energy transition, at least not here in Europe, given how dependent we are on oil and gas, which I think has meant that people have started to value and look at the ethical dimensions of oil and gas in much different ways, beyond just finance and beyond just adopting the narrative that it's bad, because they realize that, wait a second, my lives are really entwined with oil and gas in a way that I didn't quite appreciate until my gas bill quadrupled in 4 months. So.
Well, and I think what you're touching on too is sort of the pain point of the end user, and I kind of want to come back to the role of the lender, the creditor, the financier is the focus of your research, and sort of given this instability today, just using this example, how do you think financiers, lenders, creditors are viewing their risk rate? And I can say this with confidence. In the past, working on the Obama administration, it's not the first time Russia shut off gas to Europe, but it is the first time that I think there's been a deepening and a doubling of a pursuit towards alternatives to that extractive supply chain, towards renewables, which in the past, 10, 15 years ago was a very much a nice to have. Do you think financiers and sort of the financial markets, given these metrics, the expectations, as you described, around being able to predict the future flows, the future cash flows, the stability of their investment, that we'll see a sort of urgency, I guess, maybe like a relook, at the place and the role that looking at the hydrocarbons industry and where it's been, to the role that we may see shifting towards renewables and other things, as a view on risk, stability and risk?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I've continued the conversation with many interlocutors in tech, so I stay in touch with them, as well as folks here in the UK, so private equity and other financiers who are focused on the North Sea rather than, say, the lower 48 United States. And there's a couple of things that I understand that are happening from all the information that I've been taking in. One is that the investors that were in the shale revolution, that were invested in the United States, many of them have left and haven't quite come back. And so, because there was, for a period of time, there was some risk, but the return and the probability of return that was so great that people were willing to take that chance. Institutional investors were willing to take that chance, and the larger economic environment kind of let that happen. So, for example, interest rates were really low when the markets crashed in 2008, 2009. All of a sudden, investors were looking for a place to put money they could get really good returns. And it just so happened that the shale revolution was red hot then. So it made sense for institutional investors to put money there. We're in a very different economic situation now, where interest rates are much different. There's no sort of new technology that we're kind of figuring out. They weren't quite sure what unconventional extraction was going to look like. So there was still a bit of a mystique around it. I think that mystique is now gone. But at the same time, we have investors that are increasingly interested. They have constituents, so it'd be their pensioners, their students, and their larger constituents asking for more ESG requirements. And so they might be more interested in investing in, say, solar panels or a wind farm or some sort of kinetic energy generation. But the sort of return that you're going to get on that is much more sort of even. You can kind of predict, there's some difference in wind speed and such, but you can kind of predict what the revenue is going to be versus the cost, as opposed to going out and drilling an oil well and finding, oh my goodness, there's so much more oil. Oh, this is a big windfall. So the types of economic returns, the types of risks associated with that are much different. And so I think we are in a very different economic environment. And I don't think the return, there's sort of no energy environment except for offshore oil and gas drilling, which only the big majors are doing. That's where you still have that big risk return ratio. And that's why you have companies like Shell and Chevron and Exxon going to drill these big offshores, because while it's really expensive and really risky to do, the return on those is massive. But very few economic entities have that capacity to take that risk and return.
That makes really good sense. And, one question that's come in through the chat, you may or may not have watched the State of the Union address by President Biden last night, but he made a statement that, the oil and gas industry is needed for our energy future, at a minimum in the near term, which I think he couched in the next 10 to 15 years, if I remember correctly. And so the question is around the statement being based, at least in part, on models crafted by people who are incentivized by the shape of their financial models and the extent to which they are have internalized them to tell them that particular story. What are your thoughts on that statement?
So I did catch parts of it, but it was definitely in the middle of the night here. So I think I only caught the sort of highlights from the State of the Union. So the question is, do they internalize the models and then use
Well, I think it's more about who's incentivized in the storytelling, and in this case, I think the question or the person's asking, is it partly the folks who have invested in some of these oil and gas, investments that may be shaping the narrative that it has to be part of our energy future. And I think they're looking for you to weigh in on maybe that ethical conflict to be shaping the narrative if you have a financial return or investment expectation.
Right. No, of course. And so, many of the people I chat with say, listen, you can say that I'm biased, but I have a particular perspective because I'm invested in oil and gas. And so I have a particular incentive to see my oil and gas investments turn out. But beyond that, many of them, and I, looking at all the data that I'm looking at, so I look at qualitative, quantitative, and I sort of keep my eye on what's happening in the world. I could be wrong, but looking at everything that's happened in the last, 12 months, 13 months, looking at what has happened here in Europe, looking at the increasing dependencies of oil and gas, at least in this region, and other regions it's a bit different, but at least in Europe, and I think my statistics, I haven't looked at the statistics in the United States in the last 2 months, but I'm pretty sure it's also heavily dependent on gas for heating and on oil for transportation in the form of petroleum. I don't see that we are going to move away from oil and gas anytime in the next couple of years. And I think this is actually complicated by the fact that I have some close colleagues here, Professor Adrian Finch and some others who work in critical metals. This is the crux of our energy ethics dilemma, is that we are dependent not only on oil and gas for the immediate future and the foreseeable future, you could call that 5 to 10 years, but the energy transition is also dependent on getting enough critical minerals to make the materials that we need to make the wind turbines, to make the solar panels. And my close colleague, Professor Adrian Finch, was basically showed me a map, and this is an area he specialized in. The most rare critical minerals in the world that we need for these technologies come from 2 mines in China. Now, we can get them from other places, but they're often co-associated with radioactive material, which creates a whole other ethical dilemma of trying to get these minerals out of the ground to make renewable technologies. We could get them from places like Greenland, but that also means disturbing and mining huge ecological reserves to get these rare minerals. So the crux of our energy dilemma, the energy ethics project that our larger center is sort of invested in investigating, is how do we resolve this? We're not going to see a decline in energy demand, but yet there are no easy answers. So yeah, I think that hopefully that's a bit of an answer.
It is, and I think it highlights the complexity of the energy transition, and there's no sort of silver bullet. And there were sort of a series of questions that came through ahead of the call, or ahead of the presentation around carbon tax. And I think I'm going to frame the question. We only have a few more minutes. You're talking about sort of incentives and returns, and I'm wondering what you think about disincentives or penalties. And so the concept of a carbon tax, what is your view on the role of that? And is it policy makers that drive that? Is it financial markets that might sort of value emissions as a part of their metrics? Is it companies who might drive that? But generally interested in your view on carbon tax and the role it might play in the transition. there you go. You're back. So you're on mute, but summarizing the question, generally interested in your view on the role that carbon tax might play in the energy transition.
Yeah, so I know we only have a few minutes left. Carbon, like in the realm of tax, there's many things that could constitute a carbon tax. And I think one of my worries would be, what does a carbon tax not just mean for financial markets and investors or people that are maybe well endowed to absorb that, but what will that mean for everyday people? So will a carbon tax all of a sudden mean that it's going to cost low and middle income families a lot more to get to and from work, to and from school? And what sort of transition does that facilitate? Who bears the weight of a transition? And so, we talk about this a lot at the center here about what does a equitable energy transition look like. And I'm not sure, depending on what sort of carbon tax we're talking about, who's going to bear the brunt of that. I'm not certain that the carbon tax is the solution. Maybe it's part of a solution, but I think that I've often heard that what we need is a carbon tax to facilitate this energy transition. I'm not convinced yet that is the sort of silver bullet. So will a carbon tax all of a sudden mean we have a lot more investment in renewable energy production? I'm not convinced unless the financial infrastructure is in place to take that tax money and invest it in that sort of infrastructure. And moreover, again, we have to think about when we put taxes in place, who is going to bear the burden of those taxes? And unfortunately, what I often see is that the burden is often through various, either directly or indirectly, burdened, put on the sort of people who least afford to take that on.
That's, I think, a good way to end. I was going to ask you for your last thoughts, but I feel like that leaves us with inviting you back for another talk on that topic alone. So,
love to.
So thank you so much for sharing your research. I'm going to turn it back over to Amanda.
Sean, April, thank you very much for a really interesting conversation about wide-ranging, right, about ethics in a number of different ways of thinking about ethics in this context of energy transitions, the financing of energy transitions, the role that we see different players and actors taking on, and I really appreciate your comments here about looking at this also from that framework of justice, right? Who is bearing the burden? Who is accruing the benefits, right? So thank you very much for a really fascinating hour. I just want to, in addition to thanking you all, thanking you both, I want to flag for folks what's coming up next in our new energy series. And so we have 2 weeks from today, we will be hearing from Emily Paktigian. She is an associate professor in public policy and
Amanda, we've lost your audio. I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry. Early life exposure to clean cooking transitions, impacts on cognition and health. And then 2 weeks from that, we will be visiting with Vivek Shastri, who is a doctoral student at the University of Texas, also in a public policy program, looking at productive uses of decentralized renewable energy, particularly in developing countries and developing country contexts. So again, my big thanks to Sean and to April for joining us today for today's talk. My thanks to all of you for tuning in to this latest in our new energy series of conversations with folks who are on the cutting edge of energy, climate, and society research, sharing their work with us. We hope to see you in 2 weeks' time for the next show. And everyone, be well. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.